Welcome to West Falmouth Preparative Meeting, your host for Second Sunday Forum. Today is July 9th, 2023. And our speaker from New Hampshire, Jnana Hodson, will talk about his book, Quaking Dover, about how a Quaker counterculture took root and flourished in Colonial New Hampshire. We acknowledge we're on Wampanoag land. And please welcome Jnana Hodson. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And I would like to welcome everybody. Thank everyone for being here today. When I started this, I didn't realize that Dover meeting was one of the 7 oldest Quaker meetings in the New World. And in fact, one of the oldest in the US. West Falmouth, of course, is part of Sandwich meeting, which is also among those 7 earliest, perhaps the oldest. But other people get in on the arguing rights, so I'll leave that for elsewhere. But my book really wound up looking at how the congregation and surrounding town and watershed differed from the Puritan imprint that commonly defines New England. The Boston is the hub of the universe conceit. What emerged is an alternative history that challenges the traditional accounts. I do hope you'll also find ways that Quakers on the Cape embodied something similar. As you'll see, my story is rooted in the lands of the Pennacook people and their wider indigenous culture. And today I'm speaking to you from the ancestral grounds of the Passamaquoddy of the Wabanaki Alliance in easternmost Maine. If you come to visit me, you'll pass a sign that we'll soon see on the slide sharing. That's the Tepiac Reservation. And if you drive to Eastport, Maine, where I am, you will definitely pass through the reservation. Next slide. I should say that the Wabanaki, an incredible story of survival of the people against impossible odds. I'm seeing many parallels in their history and Quakers in the face of what many today are calling empire. In scheduling today's event, Erica picked up on the sense that Dover could be seen as a haven for sustaining progressive activism in the face of harsh opposition. Her enthusiastic response soon had me rethinking. It was like stepping back from a painting, in this case, one filled with social, economic, political, religious, and cultural conflicts, along with a full cast of prominent individuals and extended families, and then seeing something unexpected jump out. Well, you expect that from a painter, and she's very talented. So here's some of what I'm sensing from that new perspective. Let me emphasize that each point is rich enough to easily fill one of these hourly presentations. So today we'll only be touching on them. First, I see change coming from the fringe, but also having roots. Quakers weren't an invasion, as I originally thought, but a gathering into a critical mass of people already here. In Dover's case, that includes one of the first 2 settlers, almost 40 years before the Quakers arrived, someone who was even briefly governor. As for message, this might surprise you, but there is a remarkable theology embedded in our alternative Christianity. From that, we could appeal to a common referent with the Puritans and argue that they were falling way short. It was also much larger than a party platform, but a referent for an encompassing metaphor more than legality rules. Metaphor comes out of experience, hands-on knowledge. Our message appealed both to the mind and the heart. We also had a meaningful identity. It had a distinctive lifestyle with plain dress, for instance, but things like that made Quakers more sympathetic to people at the fringe of the wider society. The focus also led to an economic base within extended families. Quakers were directed to marry only other Quakers who would understand the teachings and practices. One historian, Carla Gardinas Pestana, in per Quakers and Baptists in colonial Massachusetts, sees the Quaker expectations leading to a kind of tribalism, which was also its strength. In other words, people stood out as a peculiar people. Not only were women recorded as ministers and elders, and Dover apparently had some powerful ones, they also conducted their own half of the business agenda, including the appropriation of funds. Significantly, this would be the foundation of the suffragette movement. The organization shared leadership and responsibility upward as well as downward, rather than only top-down from a central executive. What emerged was polycentric, interactive, and had strong grassroots at work. It included ways of addressing grievances and conflict. The quarterly meeting and yearly meeting served as courts of appeal. When there were difficulties in a marriage, a husband had to answer to representatives from the women's side of the meeting. Back to the matriarch noted earlier. The geographic component meant neighborhoods, meeting houses, schools, and other gathering places that allowed a degree of separation from the wider society. As for the shared language, Friends had a plain speech of thee and thou and funny ways of numbering the days of the week and months of the year, but it also extended into much of what the message of the meeting were incomprehensible to the wider community. The language also included an emphasis on honesty that could be personally to others. The support from the outside included sympathetic individuals in high places, and also sometimes legal things that helped. For instance, when New Hampshire came under Massachusetts management in 1640, the province had two key exemptions from the rest of Massachusetts. You didn't have to be a member of the official church to vote in town elections or to hold land. In other words, becoming a friend didn't cost you your political voice or your property. In addition, there was support from the wider world of Friends, not just as traveling ministers who spread both the message and potential business contacts, but also financial relief in times of suffering, as you'll see during the ongoing warfare on the New England frontier. When this worked well, not always a given considering human nature, it gives us a model for looking at creating what some Friends today call the beloved community, or in biblical terms, the peaceable kingdom. Let's start off then by placing Dover in context. Next slide, please. If you travel up Interstate 95, when you cross into Maine, if I had a little pointer, I'd follow you up the coast, but when you cross into Maine, look up left upstream from the big bridge. That's on the Piscataqua River. Where the river bends, you'll see Hilton Point, where Dover originated. You've passed that close to Dover without knowing it, assuming that many of you have already gone to Maine. Dover's also where two English fishermen landed 400 years ago, launching what has become the seventh oldest European settlement in the continental US. For the record, tiny Dover is older than Boston, and for the remainder of the 1660s, it was a center of much activity in both New Hampshire and Maine. Next slide. One startling point that popped out at me as I delved into this project was that many of Dover's early residents were not from East Anglia, on the right-hand side of the slide. That East Anglia is where the Puritan migration beginning in 1630. Dover, in contrast, was from Devonshire, down on the lower left. It had much different values and traditions from the East Anglia Puritans. David Hackett Fisher in Albion's Seed details these differences as folkways, things that range from dialect to food to courtship and marriage, work and wealth, politics, housing and settlement patterns. Well, it's a long list. What happened was the well-financed, highly organized Puritan invasion often pushed out earlier settlers, and including Salem, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Conflicts were inevitable. The Puritans considered the earlier West Country planters and fishermen superstitious and backward. Many of those first settlers, in turn, preferred the Church of England, or today's Episcopal faith, to the Calvinist newcomers, if only they had priests and parishes of their own. Instead, they were left in a vacuum or forced to attend services that grated on them. In Dover, that vacuum led to rivalries over the town pulpit, including armed skirmishes. Dover could have had the first Baptist church in America a year before Providence, Rhode Island, but the turmoil forced one minister, Dover's third, to scoot back to England, where he headed London's first Baptist church for the remainder of his life. Next slide. As an example of the ongoing tensions, take the case of Elder Starbuck. We'll have to do this because we don't have pictures of a lot of the early people. A Puritan congregation was led by a professional minister responsible for preaching and administering the sacraments. He was assisted by a ruling elder, a prominent layman elected for life who could also, when necessary, preach. That brings us to Dover combination signer Edward Starbuck. In 1648, let me quote from my book, a grand jury presented Elder Starbuck for disturbing the peace of the church and for refusing to join with it in the ordinance of baptism, for which he was admonished and discharged. I'm left assuming that the case itself was not dropped, but rather that he was discharged from the position of elder after a big argument or two or more. The next year, we get a hint that the baptism issue apparently involved the matter of children, perhaps his daughter, Shua. As historian George Wadley relates, the offense apparently included the wearing of his hair beyond the statute length, after the manner of ruffians and barbarous Indians, which had been decreed by the court to be sinful. This was a case for Boston and not just the Piscataqua. By the way, is anyone else amused by this early connection of hair length and an identity as a rabble-rouser? It's right there in the court record. A decade later, ex-elder Starbuck would leave Dover, removing in 1660 to Nantucket Island off Cape Cod as one of its founding settlers. To his son Nathaniel, born in Dover, he's the ancestor of nearly all Starbuck family members in America. In addition, Edward's daughter-in-law, Mary Coffin, passionately persuaded the other Nantucket families to join the Society of Friends, creating a Quaker stronghold. But no, he did not pioneer a namesake coffee retail empire, and the island's Folgers were of a Baptist leaning. Quite simply, there were significant pockets of marginalized people in Dover, along the Piscataqua River watershed, and throughout New England, who were receptive to the Quaker message once it arrived. And arrive it did, like a storm, with all of 15 defiant friends from England who came to spread the message. Yes, a message that might appeal to a marginalized populace. Next slide. Again from the book, even before their arrival in the New World, the Massachusetts-based colony's General Court, including Richard Waldron of Dover, reacted by passing its first anti-Quaker measure in October 1656. The act imposed a fine of 100 pounds, or about 35 cattle, on the master of any ship that brought a Quaker into the colony. Friends who managed to set foot in the colonies were to be sent immediately to a house of correction, where they would receive 20 stripes and be confined to hard labor. Yes, flogging and hard labor. Simply importing or possessing a Quaker book meant a fine of 5 pounds, or 2 cows. And how much did a book cost then? As if that weren't enough, a year later, the Assembly adopted a harsher act that levied a 40-shilling fine against anyone who even harbored a Quaker for as much as an hour. Who was counting the minutes anyway? Nobody wore watches, did they? After the first conviction, the offender, if a man, would lose 1 ear, and upon the next conviction, the other ear. Offending women would be whipped each time. After 4 convictions, offenders, men and women alike, would have their tongue bored through with a hot iron. The intricacy of these brutal calculations remains to me at least astonishing. What was really going through the lofty minds of these puritanical legislators? And then just a year later, in 1658, the ante was up to make a second return after banishment, the capital offense. The Plymouth colony, I should explain, was relatively more tolerant. As for infection, despite the barbaric treatment, none of the Friends were dissuaded. Among those banished were Marmaduke Stevenson and William Robinson upon trial in Boston on September 12, 1659. If they returned, it would be on pain of death. Ignoring the ruling, Stevenson and Robinson instead traveled northward as far as Piscataqua, that is Dover, where they found the people very tender and loving to their message. Only 3 weeks after their release, as they moved southward, they were apprehended, this time in Salem, and subsequently imprisoned in Boston. And on October 27, they were paraded by 200 armed men to the gallows on Boston Neck, an area later known as Dover Street. Well, you get the picture. I'm sparing you a lot of gory details you'll find in the book. Friends were bold, disruptive, outspoken, even a threat to social order, at least when seen from the other side. But their message remains, even today, at odds with the status quo. I mentioned the importance of message. If you're a Quaker, you no doubt recognize what we know as our testimonies or witness. Next slide, please. Separation of church and state, the fact that we don't do water baptism or communion, like things many other churches do, the fact that we have no liturgy, no order of service, no dogma or creed, the fact that we wait in silence without a pastor or priest at the head of the meeting. We did record lay ministers who spoke approving that the rest of the meeting supported people we sometimes call public friends, people who spoke if moved by the Spirit. I mentioned earlier, marriage restricted to other Quakers. That was because much of the faith was handed down at home. Difficulty for us today would have been the no-vein entertainments. Well, it eliminated gaming, racing, fashion. It also eliminated music, theater, fiction, even headstones on graves. And of course, our distinctive way of doing business, where we never take a vote. Next slide, please. Some of you may know these as spices, but honesty went beyond just a refusal to swear oaths, nonviolence, equality, that of God and all people. The simplicity originated as plainness, where we had our own way of dressing and our own language. Direct spiritual experience, I think, is very, very important, not what you'll find emphasized in a lot of churches. And again, a community of faith, including mutual discipleship, but also extending into economic opportunities, refusal to take other Quakers to court, and a wide network of friends on both sides of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. At this point, Dover had grown slowly from the fishing outpost at the conflux of the what I have marked as Hilton Point down there, surrounded by rich fishing waters. When you take I-95 up north into Maine, you'd be off the lower right-hand corner of the map here. Portsmouth at that time was known as Strawberry Bank. The region was rich with fishing, lumbering, and shipbuilding as the principal industries. About 5 miles north of Hilton Point on the Cocheco River, where I have Cocheco Village marked, are the impressive waterfalls of the Cocheco River, where Richard Waldron erected saw and grist mills beginning in 1642. The village that grew around him was largely his fiefdom. Another village formed on the mouth of the Oyster River to the left of Hilton Point. That's now part of Durham today, but it was part of Dover early on. And many of the towns around there, today's towns split off from there. As the population moved northward, an ominous shift in the settlement's character was occurring, centered on Waldron, someone I sometimes call the perfect villain. Next slide. You're looking at a portrait of his namesake grandson, likely giving you an idea of the family itself. The elder Waldron was immensely able, forceful, and ambitious, the sixth son of a well-off Puritan family. He arrived with his eldest brother in 1635 when he was barely 20. He returned to England in 1637, married a young gentlewoman despite her parents' opposition, and brought her to Dover. Her names and dates are unknown. After her death, he then married Anne Scammon and had 11 children. In 1642, when he acquired the rights to the land around the falls in downtown Dover, he began controlling much of the native trade and amassing large land holdings. In pressing for Dover and New Hampshire to submit to Massachusetts jurisdiction, he placed himself in opposition to first settler Thomas Roberts, who lost office when the Dover province was subsumed by the Bay Colony. Roberts and his wife became Quaker when the Quakers arrived. Waldron, in contrast, became a deputy to the Massachusetts General Court, or legislature, in 1654, where he served for the next 22 years, 7 of them as general speaker, one of the most powerful posts in New England. How much time did he spend in Boston during this period, and how much in Dover? At least 3 of his children were born in Boston. If you need more drama, add drum rolls or a vibrating organ. Next slide. We have no indication what was happening with the 15 dissident Dover families after their initial court convictions for non-attendance at church in late 1659, after Marmaduke Stevenson and William Robinson left and were executed. Perhaps the division simply continued in open sight, but a Quaker flashpoint unquestionably erupted in 1662 when Mary Tompkin and Alice Ambrose, both from England, accompanied by George Preston from York, England, and Edward Wharton from Salem, Massachusetts, came to town and took up quarters at an inn. The 4 Quakers weren't reticent when it came to confronting the town's Puritan minister, John Rayner, who was from Yorkshire rather than a locally prominent Devon culture. Rayner had more than theological grounds for feeling agitated. His very livelihood could be eliminated if the Quakers became the majority. Did he breathe a sigh of relief when his vocal opponents roved off across the river into Maine, even though a number of his worshipers each Sunday lived in the province of Maine? But then, in October 1662, after their stay in Maine, Tompkin and Ambrose returned to Dover in a visit in the love of the gospel to the individuals newly convinced on the Piscataqua, in which service they were joined by Anne Coleman, also from England. Events quickly escalated, as I describe in my book, to the point that the 3 women were arrested, convicted, stripped to the waist, and tied to the back of an ox cart to be whipped in every town between Dover and Dedham, south of Boston. Here's where Waldron comes into prominence in our story. As deputy of the Massachusetts General Court, he was party to the approval of the Cart and Whip Act in 1662, which he now imposed as a magistrate in Dover. If he couldn't execute the 3 offenders outright, he might do it more subtly. The distance from Dover to Dedham was about 80 miles, spanning 11 towns at the time. And the women were to go forth naked to the waist in midwinter. They weren't the only women, or men for that matter, to be punished under this act, not by a long shot, but their sentence became the most infamous, memorialized by John Greenleaf Whittier's 1883 poem, How the Women Went from Dover. And this was used to illustrate that poem in a collection of his poems. A few towns down the road, an outraged constable refused to carry out the sentence and instead set them free. The women returned to Dover to continue their mission. Next slide, please. You're looking at Hilton Point across the Piscataqua River from what was the manor of Major Nicholas Shapley, Waldron's counterpoint in Maine. Shapley, an inquiring man of truth, had invited the missionaries to his house and with his wife, then permitted Quaker meetings to be held there. He was prominently from Devon, and with him its code of neighborliness is apparent. His open-mindedness would cost him. In 1663, the town constable was ordered to go to Shapley's house on first days to prevent the holding of meetings there. In 1669, Shapley and another selectman, plus the town clerk, were all accused of being Quakers and removed by the county court. The town then had to elect others. Dover's Richard Waldron had a hand in the ongoing actions. In 1664, Shapley was imprisoned in Massachusetts, but released on the plea of his half-sister, Catherine Hilton, now the wife of Dover's co-founder, plus the payment of 200 pounds, the equivalent of perhaps 60 or 70 cows. Guilt by mere association carried a stiff price. As you'll see in the book, Shapley is also an important and largely overlooked figure in the founding of Maine, and I believe in the survival of Quakers in Upper New England. Next slide. Support and nurture from the wider Quaker world continued. Even though Dover was on the frontier of English settlement, it was not ignored after the departure of its first missionaries in the service of Friends. By now, a third of Dover identified as Quaker. For perspective, there were perhaps 60 households in the entire town, the largest of the 4 towns in New Hampshire. Among the Quakers who came calling was Elizabeth Houghton, who during her second visit to America between late 1663 and 66, spent a lot of time in the Dover area. She's a vastly underestimated figure in Quaker history, typically described as George Fox's first convert, though I will argue otherwise. To me, she is the first Quaker, period, and the first mother of the Quaker movement, no slight to Margaret Fell later. In these visits, she was in her early 60s. In those days, ocean crossings were lengthy and arduous, yet after intense persecution in her first visit, she returned to England and then shot back to New England within a year, carrying with her a letter from the king allowing her to buy land and thus escape the vagrancy law. Not that the letter was accepted anywhere in New England. She still underwent harsh persecution, much of it under the Cart and Whip Act. Quite simply, despite her age, she was tough in her body, emotions, and soul, and nothing would deter her or her Quaker colleagues from spreading their message. When her travels this time brought her into New Hampshire, she was jailed in Hampton for testifying against the rapacity of a priest in seizing the goods of a friend, 2 actually, and not just their goods, but most of their estates, including threats to sell their children into slavery. The priest's parents were the noted Puritan minister John Cotton and the daughter of Massachusetts Governor Simon Bradstreet. Next, at Dover and Piscataqua, as she put it, during a very cold weather, she was placed in stocks and imprisoned for 4 days. But the Lord upheld and preserved my life, where my service to the Lord was profitable for friends and leaving others without an excuse. Afterward, her travails in Cambridge were even worse. Somehow, in the aftermath, Dover Quakers achieved a kind of detente. Next slide, please. The next pivotal event in the Piscataqua watershed occurred in 1676 during King Philip's War, after a number of natives fleeing Massachusetts Bay militia received shelter among the Pennachucks living around Dover. In a standard account of the events, Massachusetts ordered Richard Waldron to attack these natives and turn any refugee combatants over to them. Waldron believed he could capture the natives without a pitched battle by resorting to subterfuge, and so on September 7, 1776, he invited the natives, about 400 in total, half local and half refugees, to participate in a mock battle against the militia. After the natives had fired the guns, Waldron, aided by Major Charles Frost of Maine, took them prisoner. Frost had replaced Nicholas Shapley as commander of the Maine militia. Waldron then sent both the refugee combatants and those locals who violently objected to this forced breach of hospitality to Boston, where 7 or 8 leaders were convicted of insurrection and executed, including old Jethro, to whom Waldron may have promised amnesty. The rest of the captives were sold into slavery in foreign parts, mostly Barbados. The funds were used to cover expenses of conducting King Philip's War. Let me repeat, the funds from the sale into slavery were used to cover the expenses of conducting King Philip's War. We could stop here for discussion, but my examination of an alternative history of New England continues. The usual take, next slide, please. The usual take on Dover's mock battle or war games comes from Waldron's account and often has most of the captives being returned peacefully. In contrast, the indigenous version handed down orally has the event being an invitation to a feast. Only 20 of the natives were armed, and 350 people, mostly women and children, were taken and sold and never returned. That figure is confirmed and newly discovered documents. Among the consequences was the fall of a peaceful Christian Wanalanset as Stockholm and the rise of the warlike Caucamangas. Quakers were no doubt appalled by Waldron's dishonesty and physical violence, as well as the enslavement. New England Friends, including children, had faced being sold into slavery by Puritan authorities at the height of the persecutions. Moreover, Friends cherished good relations with the natives. The local Pennacook never forgave Waldron for the deception, which violated all the rules of honor and hospitality valued by both sides, especially those Devonshire roots. In my research, I've been astonished by the English hostilities even before settlement began. It exposed an arrogant attitude of supremacy, not just white, but Northern European and especially British. Equally troubling was seeing how that fed into racial slavery, beginning with the exchange of native captives for Africans who would be less likely to blend into surrounding encampments if they escaped. Next slide, please. In the face of continuing tensions in 1665 and on, some houses in Dover were ordered to be fortified, set within palisades, and designated as places of shelter for several neighbors in the event of an attack. These were the garrison houses. In 1689, 13 years after the deceptive mock battle party, an estimated 50 such sites existed within and around the sprawling town of Dover. Hearing rumblings of trouble, however, Waldron shrugged off the warnings and told alarmed housewives to go plant their pumpkins. He would take care of the natives. Instead, on June 28, the village at Cocheco Falls was attacked. 5 or 6 dwelling houses were burned, along with the mills. 52 colonists, a full quarter of the entire population, were captured or slain. The event was the most catastrophic in Dover's history, more from the shock than the casualty toll. Neighboring Oyster River would fare worse, along with other settlements. Led by Chief Caucamangas, this was the beginning of King William's War, a series of massacres orchestrated by Jean-Vinci de Badie de Saint-Castin and Father Louis Pertuis. In New England, the conflict originated in the failure of the English settlers to adhere to the treaties and agreements made at the end of King Philip's War 10 years earlier. But the renewed outbreak of hostilities was also the North American theater of hostilities originated when King James II, the last of England's suspected secretly Roman Catholic kings, was deposed and replaced by the Glorious Revolution and in the Glorious Revolution by the Protestants William and Mary. In the Cocheco raid, the sword-wielding elderly Waldron was cut across his belly with knives, with each warrior saying, "I cross out my account." The indigenous version has Waldron's denies being more detailed. His nose and ears were cut off and stuffed in his mouth, as were his thumbs. To the natives, he had turned his nose to injustice, refused to hear all sides, cheated on weights in trade by placing his thumb on the scale. He also avoided trading them useful goods they desired and instead paid them in rum and trinkets. He had even limited their movement east of the Merrimack River in New Hampshire. Their list of great injustices went on. So in the attack, at Richard Otis's garrison, the 64-year-old blacksmith, his son Stephen and daughter Hannah were killed. His third wife, Brazil, 3-month-old daughter, Margaret, 3 daughters from his first marriage, Judith Rose and experience, and at least 2 grandchildren were taken captive. 1 adult son, Richard Jr., escaped. The garrison was burned. The Otis family was Quaker. Early on, Richard, along with his wife and maid, were once fined for missing 13 congregational services when they worshiped instead with friends. Now in the attack, his granddaughter Mary and her 2 brothers were among those taken prisoner. The brothers were carried off to Canada and never returned. The Dover instances were the first recorded cases of British captives abducted and sold in Quebec, a practice that became common. Mary, however, was rescued in Conway and came back to Dover. About 4 years later, she married Ebenezer Varney, another survivor, and they built a large house on the west side of what's now known as Garrison Hill. Not that theirs was a garrison. There they had 13 children. In spite of their experience, or maybe because of it, they always left the door unbolted at night so that natives might enter and warm themselves. Next slide, please. This was their house. As family history relates, it was no unusual thing for them to find several friendly Indians sleeping before the big fireplace in the morning. For the next 5 decades, Dover would be on the frontier of hostilities. Think about trying to maintain a peaceable presence in the midst of a recurring war zone. Still, there was the struggle of keeping the faith under prolonged adverse conditions. And contrary to some accounts, being a Quaker was no guarantee you would be spared from attack. New England Friends faced unique dilemmas. Massachusetts required all able-bodied men to muster for militia training and deployment. And as for the Quakers, then what? Would they lag at the rear of the march or take ready aim in combat? In Rhode Island and the Plymouth colony, some were allowed to stand watch unarmed and perform other non-combatant roles, an alternative service that other Friends still objected to as unacceptable participations in the workings of war. Records are missing for New Hampshire. Do note that Quaker understanding of pacifism as well as government reactions to it would evolve in the years culminating in the American Revolution. Massachusetts authorities had required the town's second Puritan meeting house, by default a town hall, to be surrounded by a palisade. A recent archaeologic dig found that Dover residents did so reluctantly and did not bury the bottom ends as ordered. It was in their next meeting house, a Pine Hill site reflecting a population shift toward Cochico Village, that visiting Quaker minister Samuel Bonus in 1704 observed, "Our next meeting was to be in the center of the meetings, which we had before, in a considerable large house, but not big enough for the company by far, and the country was all alarmed, so that it was a very large meeting indeed." The cause of alarm, renewed hostilities. It being wartime with the Indians, the people brought such weapons as they had to meeting, so that when we came to the meeting house, I was surprised to see so many firearms and other instruments of war standing against the meeting house wall. However, I was before told that it was the custom of the other non-Quaker people to do so, and I found those firearms and warlike weapons belonged to the other people, not the Friends that were come to meeting. Thus, as Bonus explains, I was likewise concerned here to put them, the Quakers, upon recording their sufferings and a way how to do it, for they were sufferers not only on account of the hireling preachers to maintain them in their pride and idleness, Friends were, after all, taxed to support the town's congregational church and its minister, but also on the account of bearing arms, which was likewise pretty heavy on them in some towns. But then in others, their neighbors were moderate and made not so much ado about them. Again, Friends were taxed to support the militia. Bonus raised objections, but some did comply to pay off their quota about the bearing of arms, who would not pay a duit to the parson. They seen very clearly that they were wrong and preached themselves and for themselves. His journal includes details on Friends who refused to go at night to the garrisons and other struggles. Next slide, please. The final foray in Dover was on a Quaker family. John Hanson's house on Knox Marsh was in an exposed position. Because of renewed troubles, he was advised by neighbors to move into the more compact area of Cochico Village. Instead, as a stiff Quaker, upholding the Friends' witness of good relations with the natives, he stayed put. Life looked good to him. On August 9, 1725, his eldest daughter, Hannah, and Israel Hodgson, a neighbor, wed in a Quaker service. 4 years later, Hanson's wife gave birth to 4 days later, Hanson's wife gave birth to daughter Mary, also known as Mercy. Only 2 weeks after those celebrations, though, 13 natives, including French Mohawks, lay in wait for several days, looking for an opportunity to attack. On August 27, while Hanson and daughter Hannah attended midweek Quaker worship, and his 2 eldest sons were working at some distance, the natives swept in and, all naked with their guns and tomahawks, entered the house. Elizabeth Meader Hanson was home, along with a servant and 3 children. 2 young sons playing in the orchard would have escaped, but just as the Indians had finished rifling the house, the boys, Ebenezer, age 5, and Caleb, 4, came in sight and made such noise that the natives immediately killed them by bashing out their brains and scalping them in front of their mother to stop the alarm. Daughter Sarah entered the house and was also taken. The raiders promptly started for Canada, their captives in tow. Elizabeth Hanson, who had given birth to daughter Mary just 2 weeks before, plus a 7-year-old son Daniel, daughter Sarah 16, and Elizabeth 14, and the servant girl. The attack and departure came swiftly and quietly. Newlywed Hannah discovered the carnage on her return home from worship. Elizabeth Hanson's arduous ordeal turned into 5 months of captivity, which she later related in detail. The 250-mile trek to Canada was merciless, leaving the captives wet, cold, bruised, and hungry. At one stretch, they had nothing to eat but tree bark, and Elizabeth feared for her infant as her milk began to dry up. Funds for the family's ransom included a large sum collected by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and her husband quickly went to Canada to redeem them. The price for Elizabeth and baby Mary was around £700. He also obtained the release of son Daniel and daughter Elizabeth, but the natives would not release Sarah on any terms, though they did allow the father and daughter several hours together. In Quebec, Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Sabourin had interposed with the natives and persuaded Sarah to obtain her freedom by marrying him, which she did on June 1727. In my book, I noticed how French spellings of the names complicate the record. Next slide, please. For another take on the hostilities, consider this roadside marker in Elliott, Maine. What the marker doesn't mention is that Major Frost was the highest ranking military officer in Maine, and he conspired with Richard Waldron nearly 21 years early in the trickery in Dover. I am astonished at the natives' patience in delivering retaliation. There's far more to the evolution of Dover Friends meeting, even more once we get on beyond the struggles of the early decades. But for today, let's leap ahead. Next slide, please. Visitors to the meeting house are often puzzled by the anvil that sits in one corner of the space where we worship, the former men's side of the house. We have no traditional symbols of religion in the room, no cross or crucifix, no stained glass windows, no pulpit or altar. Only this. I was told that the anvil came from the ashes of one of the burned garrisons and came down to us through what would have been Mary Otis. Yes, the one who had been taken captive and carried to Canada, marrying Ebenezer Varney on her return and then always leaving the house door unlatched. The anvil stands as a reminder of that witness, especially fitting considering that Richard Otis, her father, had been a blacksmith. One Sunday morning, however, as I was sitting nearby, I noticed the sunlight illuminating a very faint Brooklyn Manufacturing Company imprint. Thinking that would have been an object cast in the 17th century, I asked Silas Weeks for clarification. Oh, he replied, it's from the plow-making Hussey family, the ones who melted down cannons after the Civil War. Something along those lines. Well, it is another reminder of peace and peacemaking, the prophet Isaiah's swords and the plowshare's vision. I like both versions. Now that I've completed this history and writing this history and publishing it and chanced upon a number of other blacksmiths who are active friends, I'm thinking of the anvil in yet another light, a muscular side that spirituality also demands. Next slide, please. So that's a sampling of the situations that gave rise to what's emerged as a distinctive counterculture in New Hampshire and Maine. This piece of needlework sits in the meeting room and is a quotation from George Fox. Next slide, please. And since I've mentioned the importance of place, this is our third meeting house, which was erected in a single day in 1768 in the manner of an Amish barn raising. It continues to serve as a center of our community today. Okay. As we head into questions and answers, I should add the disclaimer that I'm not a historian, but rather a writer and journalist pursuing a story that ultimately ranged far beyond Dover. Still, as a professional historian pointed out after one of these presentations, this is an important alternative to the conventional accounts. New England history, he said, is told through Harvard and then secondarily Yale and Williams College. Or maybe we should say it's filtered, meaning through Greater Boston especially. Maybe you on the Cape will appreciate this. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, here's the book, which is available both online in paper and ebook editions. or you can order yours through your favorite bricks and mortar bookstore or ask your library to acquire one. Now, if we're ready for questions and answers, who's next?
The answers are the questions, excuse me, should be put in the chat. And this is his book, not too long to read and very well written. And Jnana has been on the trail of promoting his book, I think, since the fall. And it reads very, very well. It's more of a narrative with information. A number of people have wanted copies of this talk, and I suggested that they will be emailed a link when it's edited. I forgot to say that it's filmed, and that also it's put on the West Falmouth Facebook account. It's open to everybody on Facebook.
There was a question about access to the slides. I have a blog on Jnana's Red Barn, and the pictures are up there. I've been running them through the year. So if you want to join there and pick up other things. We didn't do much with photos in the book because for technical reasons. So it is what it is. One of the things that was often thrown against Quakers and other dissidents was non-attendance at public worship, that people were required to go to church on Sunday. But the reality was, at the time the Quakers arrived, there were only 38 churches or so in all of New England. And for, I don't know, 30 to 50,000 people, they would not have fit in those buildings. So one of those things that wasn't brought up very much. Also, Puritans get a lot of flack for their persecution, but in reality, it probably was much more lenient than it was in Virginia. At least one historian has said that's got to be a dark secret that we need to follow more. There's a question about any New England Native and Quaker peacemaking initiatives. Not that I know of. The records, minutes were pretty scarce, even at the yearly meeting level. And in Dover, the minutes disappeared before 1701. And as we find going through minutes, sometimes the most important things aren't put down at all. You find things like I quoted from visiting ministers for perspective. But I know people are looking into it. In Maine, maybe because the tribes have survived up here, there's been far more work going in, but even some of our initiatives with the natives, unfortunately, try to impose our way of life on a whole different lifestyle, and having to look into that. Okay, the question about Rose Tibbets, I don't know. The Tibbets family has kind of been hard for me to trace out, but Tibbets did publish over 10 years in his New Hampshire Genealogical Society, published the family records of Dover meeting. That's been a valuable place to find that material. And I had fortunately made photocopies a long time ago, but they're now available online if you hunt around. Okay, the question of what called me to look closely at this period of time. It was that statement that had been bandied around that a third of the town had become Quaker. And I wondered, how did that happen? You know, as I said, the impression I had was that the Quakers kind of invaded New England, and with this outside message, and like latecomers, we're taking our time getting started. But as I got into it, it was finding this whole different culture, and a group that was ready for change, was hungry for change, chafing under the restrictions they were facing and the message that we're having. So I know a lot of Quaker history, but New England history was pretty new to me. I don't know about many of you, but I have this impression that the usual telling goes from that first turkey dinner that was served around the corner from Cape Cod to the Tea Party and the Paul Revere's ride with the Salem witch trials in between. And as I got into this, I started to understand the Salem witch trials probably resulted from the same kind of earlier tension, ongoing tension that Dover had. There's that saying, write about what you know. Well, there's another saying, write about what you don't know, because that's where it gets interesting. The filter on histories by Harvard and Williams Colleges. Again, this was a professional historian who dealing especially with Maine and maritime histories, found that all the books that he would go to would you'd find were either printed or edited or written by Harvard grads, and it does tend to be very heavily on the sympathetic to the Puritans, and very few of them are sympathetic to the Quakers or the Baptist. One book I highly recommend is this one by Carla Gardena Pestana, Quakers and Baptists in Colonial Massachusetts. I was glad I didn't read that before the book came out, because it was one of those that would have sent me back to the drawing board, and I really wanted to hit the Dover 400 anniversary. And it was also one of those things, if I went back to the drawing board, the book would never come out because it's still, digging. But what surprised me was that in Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was only one Quaker meeting. And even like into the 1840s, when you look at what had been Massachusetts Bay Colony, there weren't Quakers. The one meeting was in Salem, which then became a Lynn meeting. The other meetings were in what had been the Plymouth Bay Colony, along Buzzards Bay on the Cape, and upward from there. And of course, Rhode Island was very well documented. So the colonial era, New Hampshire history just seemed to be very tangled for me. And now I can have a much clearer sense of why it appeared convoluted. One of the things we get, did people buy the land from the Indians? The quote. Many of them did make token payments, but once the English arrived, and the French too, the land was no longer owned by anyone but the king. And so if you had land, you were kind of renting it from somebody else who was renting it from going on back. Made for a very interesting set of difficulties. In Hampton Beach, for instance, until recently, many of the houses were built on land that people didn't own. Every 100 years, they'd have to sign a new lease and start making payments. And I know of several instances now where the 100 years have come up and they're not, landowners are refusing to renew the lease. So they've got to do something with their house. And, it's a whole different perspective. So you get this thing of people buying the colony, the owners of the colony. Well, I'm still not clear what they owned. It's more like they own the right to do the business with you, but so fascinated by all that. So I think that's why I looked on the colonial era more. Also with Dover meeting, by the time the mills came along, the nature of the town started to change very much. And friends were moving outward. The meeting was in a slow decline, and just wasn't as much history being generated there. Meeting house itself was empty for 50 years. We still continue to worship with one of our preparative meetings. and then reopened in 1955. But you know, you can only put so much in a book, and the history before the mills arrived in Dover also is fascinating because the mills completely changed the nature of the town. And a lot of people think that the town began in 1820 rather than 1623 that way. So does that help clarify anything?
And Rod Zorner has something to ask.
Yes, coming from the quarterly meeting just to the west, have you been able to develop an outline of how Dover quarterly sort of penetrated inland?
Yes, I did go into the way that the actually part of the history is we get in the 1800s. A lot of the smaller preparatory meetings became Dover Quarter, and a lot of the history really becomes Dover Quarterly meeting. But as families moved up the river into the up to North Sandwich, up to Lake Winnipesaukee, we had that movement. But we also had a significant movement into Maine. We had more than 80 individuals and families who relocated to the Portsmouth area or Portland area by 1800. And remember, Maine really, most of Maine wasn't reopened to settlement until after 1750 or so. But 80 families out of a small meeting was a large influence. And they've in turn married into the families and were significant in the development of Falmouth Quarter, Maine. And another 20 families in that period moved to Vassalboro, an area. Again, a large, you're talking 100 families out of a small meeting. There were also others who moved down to especially Philadelphia and became significant there. It's just, I'm sure you see that families from the Cape as they moved across the country and so on. In fact, we've got Wayne Cobb here. He can probably verify that many of the families who settled in the Portland area were came from the Cape, or so I've heard. So, okay, Wayne says his hardware has limits, so you'll have to turn to him later for that story. Actually, if you're looking for another history presentation, his story of the development of Portland meeting is absolutely fascinating.
On a personal note, could you comment on how your journey took you from Revolutionary Light to this project?
Yeah, Dover meeting got involved in the sanctuary movement. And when ICE was starting to crack down on many of our neighbors, Somersworth, which was originally part of Dover, has a very large Indonesian population. And they've been up here 20 years or more. Their children have been born here, raised here, and so on. But we couldn't stand by idly. Well, a number of other congregations joined in with us in support of this. And that led to a request for a history of the meeting. And so, okay, I thought we had something easy to grab. No, it was essentially a story of the 3 meeting houses we've had and a few of the details. No, Quaker meeting is not about the meeting houses, it's about the people. It's about the way we live, about the way we interact. So that's that went from being what I thought was going to be like a 20-page project to a 300-page manuscript, and I wound up cutting 100 pages of the history before Quakers. But the spiritual side of it is still very, very powerful for me. As I said, I was following what it would take to keep a faith community alive, and having to look at it. What does it come to to keep a socially progressive movement alive. They're one and the same, but it's still looking at it a little differently. We started to realize, for a lot of people, I think going to church was a way to get away from the pressures of the week. Sunday's a special place. You want the stained glass windows to isolate you from the rest of the world. But I think in a lot of ways, meeting brings us back to the world, our daily lives, the things in front of us, the things that are important. There's a saying that some of the best barns in New England were designed during Quaker meeting. Yeah. So that brings us back to the message. Quaker message was different, and people responded to it. Okay, I think there was a question about the Shaker communities in New England, and as far as I know, I don't see any connection with the Shakers in New England and the Quakers. They goes back in England to the Manchester area Quakers and Mother Ann Lee, but I've not seen similar names or genealogies yet. I can be wrong, but that's my impression. Okay. My background wasn't in Pennsylvania. I was born in Ohio and raised in the Midwest. My Quaker connections actually are more Midwestern and North Carolina roots than the traditional Philadelphia lines. Okay, anything else?
Someone asked Carol Beal about, your pen moved to Northern Maine. What motivated that?
Okay. I spent 3 years in Maryland in one of my moves, and then had an opportunity to come to New Hampshire. And so I was there for 34 years, and was very involved with Quakers since after college, joining a yoga ashram. I mean, spiritual journeys are interesting things to get into, but I needed a place to worship, so I started worshiping with Quakers and moving around the country. And I loved Dover, New Hampshire. Loved the meeting, loved the community. It was a commute to my job for a while, but we needed to downsize. And my wife and elder daughter found Eastport, Maine, and through some connections they had up here, and we came up. It's a small fishing village on an island, but it has a very lively art scene. And the upshot was that we wound up moving up here. I've loved it. It's been a great writing retreat. Small town life is rather fascinating, and plus we've got ocean, and that's still new to me from growing up in landlocked Ohio, looking out and seeing the tide change 20 feet or so every day. So okay, we've got a question about support for abolitionists working out of Nantucket and the Milford area, New Hampshire. Dover Friends' history with the abolitionists is best known through the Cartland family, who lived in Lee and had a large farm there, and Sojourner Truth and others had memories of it. But they were cousins of the Greenleaf Whittier and very active in the Underground Railroad and other sorts of things. As for direct support, I don't know of anything minuted on that. but a lot of things weren't recorded for sometimes for prudence sake. We do know that when it came time for manumitting slaves, that Moses Brown was very active coming up to Dover and helping a couple families that had slaves free them. That part's well documented, but no, if you've ever been recording clerk, you might have a better appreciation for what gets lost in the minutes. There was a question about that Dover's minutes. The minutes up to 1701 were lost. The question, there's a big real question of whether how thorough they were in the first place. Samuel Bonus spent a lot of time trying to get friends to keep better minutes, and that was as late as 1626. So, sorry, 1726.
Any other questions?
Andrea?
I just Googled the John Greenleaf Whittier poem, and it appeared in the Atlantic in 1883. And they have a huge archive of the Atlantic, and you can pull it up from that. But it's actually from it was published in 1883, which I thought was just interesting.
It's one of his most popular poems, surprisingly. And so it's in a number of anthologies and short versions of his poems. But and then you can quibble, you get into the history. I love the opening line, by Cochico's icy falls. Well, the courthouse, the meeting house where the trial would have been held, wouldn't have been down by the falls. It would have been actually kind of behind the current meeting house. But
That's poetic
license, I
that's,
suppose. You're right.
that's poetic license, right?
Yeah.
I think we should all unmute and clap.
Thank you so much, Jnana. I hope everybody will get a chance to read his book. And I don't know if that helps. Anyway, this has been recorded and will be edited, and the link will be sent to all the participants today and will be posted on the West Falmouth Quakers Facebook page. Thank you again. Stay well, stay connected.
Thank you all for having me.